Hi BookTube, and welcome to another Middlemarch meditation on a glorious day. You can't see this, but I've actually put a bed sheet up over our curtain pole to diffuse all the strong light that's coming in. It's about 11:30 on Monday morning, and the sunlight is so strong. This is a temperature that we're not really used to in the UK, but we're going to take it for as long as it lasts because it's been sunny all weekend. Very unusual. And the reason I'm late with this Middlemarch meditation is because I just needed to get outside and enjoy that in case we don't get as much this summer. You never can tell in the UK. And apologies to any of you who were watching the end of my Anne of Green Gables review. You would have heard me say, next Middlemarch meditation, we're going to cover chapter 28. And if you've been following all the episodes regularly, you might have been thinking, wait a second, did I miss an episode? Where did chapter 27 go? Well, the truth is that chapter 27 just went out of my memory altogether. You can tell that I had been on vacation. My bookmark was sitting at the beginning of chapter 28 in my copy of Middlemarch, but that's just because I had reviewed chapter 27 quickly in anticipation maybe of writing some of the meditation while I was away. So we're going to do part of chapter 27 today, not 28. Okay, in case you were getting worried, it's not you, it's me. And I hope you are all set up for listening comfortably, because that's what we're going to do. Go straight into reading the section that we're going to cover. Let the high muse chant love's Olympian. We are but mortals, and must sing of man. An eminent philosopher among my friends, who can dignify even your ugly furniture by lifting it into the serene light of science, has shown me this pregnant little fact: your pier glass, or extensive surface of polished steel, made to be rubbed by a housemaid, will be minutely and multitudinously scratched in all directions. But place now against it a lighted candle as a center of illumination, and lo, the scratches will seem to arrange themselves in a fine series of concentric circles round that little sun. It is demonstrable that the scratches are going everywhere impartially, and it is only your candle which produces the flattering illusion of a concentric arrangement, its light falling with an exclusive optical selection. These things are a parable. The scratches are events, and the candle is the egoism of any person now absent, of Miss Vincey, for example. Rosamond had a providence of her own, who had kindly made her more charming than other girls, and who seemed to have arranged Fred's illness and Mr. Wrench's mistake in order to bring her and Lidget within effective proximity. It would have been to contravene these arrangements if Rosamond had consented to go away to Stone Court or elsewhere, as her parents wished her to do, especially since Mr. Lidget thought the precaution needless. Therefore, while Miss Morgan and the children were sent away to a farmhouse the morning after Fred's illness had declared itself, Rosamond refused to leave Papa and Mamma. Poor Mamma, indeed, was an object to touch any creature born of woman, and Mr. Vincey, who doted on his wife, was more alarmed on her account than on Fred's. But for his insistence, she would have taken no rest. Her brightness was all bedimmed. Unconscious of her costume, which had always been so fresh and gay, she was like a sick bird with a languid eye and plumage ruffled, her senses dulled to the sights and sounds that used most to interest her. Fred's delirium, in which he seemed to be wandering out of her reach, tore her heart. After her first outburst against Mr. Wrench, she went about very quietly. Her one low cry was to Lidget. She would follow him out of the room and put her hand on his arm, moaning out, "Save my boy." Once she pleaded, "He has always been good to me, Mr. Lidgett, he never had a hard word for his mother, as if poor Fred's suffering were an accusation against him. All the deepest fibres of the mother's memory were stirred, and the young man whose voice took a gentler tone when he spoke to her was one with the babe whom she had loved, with a love new to her before he was born. "I have good hope, Mrs. Vincey," Lidgett would say. "Come down with me, and let us talk about the food." In that way he led her to the parlour where Rosamond was, and made a change for her, surprising her into taking some tea or broth which had been prepared for her. This was a constant understanding between him and Rosamond on these matters. He almost always saw her before going to the sick room, and she appealed to him as to what she could do for Mamma. Her presence of mind and adroitness in carrying out his hints were admirable, and it is not wonderful that the idea of seeing Rosamond began to mingle itself with his interest in the case, especially when the critical stage was past, and he began to feel confident of Fred's recovery. In the more doubtful time, he had advised calling in Dr. Sprague, who, if he could, would rather have remained neutral on Wrench's account. But after 2 consultations, the conduct of the case was left to Lidgett, and there was every reason to make him assiduous. Morning and evening he was at Mr. Vincey's, and gradually the visits became cheerful as Fred became simply feeble, and lay not only in need of the utmost petting, but conscious of it, so that Mrs. Vincey felt as if, after all, the illness had made a festival for her tenderness. Both father and mother held it an added reason for good spirits when old Mr. Featherstone sent messages by Lidgett saying that Fred must make haste and get well, as he, Peter Featherstone, could not do without him, and missed his visits sadly. The old man himself was getting bedridden. Mrs. Vincey told these messages to Fred when he could listen, and he turned towards her his delicate, pinched face, from which all the thick blonde hair had been cut away, and in which the eyes seemed to have got larger, yearning for some word about Mary, wondering what she felt about his illness. No word passed his lips, but to hear with eyes belongs to love's rare wit, and the mother, in the fullness of her heart, not only divined Fred's longing, but felt ready for any sacrifice in order to satisfy him. "If I can only see my boy strong again," she said, in her loving folly, "and who knows, perhaps master of Stone Court, and he can marry anybody he likes then." "Not if they won't have me, mother," said Fred. The illness had made him childish, and tears came as he spoke. "Oh, take a bit of jelly, my dear," said Mrs. Vincey, secretly incredulous of any such refusal. She never left Fred's side when her husband was not in the house, and thus Rosamond was in the unusual position of being much alone. Lidgett naturally never thought of staying along with her, yet it seemed that the brief, impersonal conversations they had together were creating that peculiar intimacy which consists in shyness. They were obliged to look at each other in speaking, and somehow the looking could not be carried through as the matter of course which it really was. Lidgett began to feel this sort of consciousness unpleasant, and one day looked down, or anywhere, like an ill-worked puppet. But this turned out badly. The next day Rosamond looked down, and the consequence was that when their eyes met again, both were more conscious than before. There was no help for this in science, and as Lidgett did not want to flirt, there seemed to be no help for it in folly. It was therefore a relief when neighbours no longer considered the house in quarantine, and when the chances of seeing Rosamond alone were very much reduced. But that intimacy of mutual embarrassment in which each feels that the other is feeling something, having once existed, its effect is not to be done away with. Talk about the weather and other well-bred topics is apt to seem a hollow device, and behaviour can hardly become easy unless it frankly recognizes a mutual fascination, which of course need not mean anything deep or serious. This was the way in which Rosamond and Lidget slid gracefully into ease and made their intercourse lively again. Visitors came and went as usual. There was once more music in the drawing-room, and all the extra hospitality of Mr. Vincey's mayoralty returned. Lidget, whenever he could, took his seat by Rosamond's side and lingered to hear her music, calling himself her captive, meaning all the while not to be her captive. The preposterousness of the notion that he could at once set up a satisfactory establishment as a married man was a sufficient guarantee against danger. This play at being a little in love was agreeable, and did not interfere with graver pursuits. Flirtation, after all, was not necessarily a singeing process. Rosamond, for her part, had never enjoyed the days so much in her life before. She was sure of being admired by someone worth captivating, and she did not distinguish flirtation from love either in herself or in another. She seemed to be sailing with a fair wind just whither she would go, and her thoughts were much occupied with a handsome house in Lowick Gate, which she hoped would by and by be vacant. She was quite determined, when she was married, to rid herself adroitly of all the visitors who were not agreeable to her at her father's, and she imagined the drawing-room in her favourite house with various styles of furniture. Certainly her thoughts were much occupied with Lidget himself. He seemed almost perfect if he had known his notes, so that his enchantment under her music had been less like an emotional elephant's, and if he had been able to discriminate better the refinements of her taste in dress, she could hardly have mentioned a deficiency in him. How different he was from young Plymdale or Mr. Caius Larcher. Those young men had not a notion of French, and could speak on no subject with striking knowledge, except perhaps the dyeing and carrying trades, which of course they were ashamed to mention. They were Middlemarch gentry, elated with their silver-headed whips and satin stocks, but embarrassed in their manners and timidly jocose. Even Fred was above them, having at least the accent and manner of a university man, whereas Lidget was always listened to, bore himself with the careless politeness of conspicuous superiority, and seemed to have the right clothes on by a certain natural affinity without ever having to think about them. Rosamond was proud when he entered the room, and when he approached her with a distinguishing smile, she had a delicious sense that she was the object of enviable homage. If Lidget had been aware of all the pride he excited in that delicate bosom, he might have been just as well pleased as any other man, even the most densely ignorant of humoral pathology or fibrous tissue. He held it one of the prettiest attitudes of the feminine mind to adore a man's preeminence without too precise a knowledge of what it consisted in. But Rosamond was not one of those helpless girls who betray themselves unawares, and whose behavior is awkwardly driven by their impulses instead of being steered by a wary grace and propriety. Do you imagine that her rapid forecast and rumination concerning house furniture and society were ever discernible in her conversation even with her mamma? On the contrary, she would have expressed the prettiest surprise and disapprobation if she had heard that another lady had been detected in that immodest prematureness, indeed would probably have disbelieved in its possibility. For Rosamond never showed any unbecoming knowledge, and was always that combination of correct sentiments, music, dancing, drawing, elegant note-writing, private album for extracted verse, and perfect blonde loveliness, which made the irresistible woman for the doomed man of that date. Think no unfair evil of her, pray. She had no wicked plots, nothing sordid or mercenary. In fact, she never thought of money except as something necessary, which other people would always provide. She was not in the habit of devising falsehoods, and if her statements were no direct clue to fact, why, they were not intended in that light. They were among her elegant accomplishments, intended to please. Nature had inspired many arts in finishing Mrs. Lemon's favorite pupil, who by general consent, Fred's excepted, was a rare compound of beauty, cleverness, and amiability. Right, that is the text. Now, I've got to tell you, I was so tempted when I was writing up my research notes to just skip the epigraph. I mean, say, okay, we've read it, everyone. It kind of says what it appears to say. It's clearly of Eliot's own composition because there's no citation in the Penguin version that we're reading, so there's no other author of this piece. And and I'd have got away with it, because I don't think we have any classical scholars who happen to be watching Middlemarch Meditations, or at least they've not made themselves known. And the problem was, too, I was tired when I came to writing this part of the research manuscript, so I was so tempted. I thought this seems a very straightforward little 2-line, it looks like the end of a sonnet or something like that. And the only thing I thought was, well, maybe I should be diligent. I do promise people that I'm going to try to do depth. So I thought, okay, what about this little 2-line bit of verse catches my eye? And I thought, well, the words high muse. I thought, why does Eliot say high muse? I mean, what other kind of muse is there? That was my thought. So I thought, okay, I will just go into Google and see what it gives me if I type in the words high muse. And do you know what happened again? A whole rabbit hole opened up. A huge one. I'll tell you what I found. I'm going to be reading from my notes a little bit. I found a blog. The blog is called Middlemarch in 2019. And the page that I was taken to by the Google search had maybe a 1,000-word essay all about this little epigraph. Now, who was the author of this blog? Well, you'll never guess. It was Adam Roberts. And you'll remember Adam Roberts. He's been fantastic. He wrote a book about Eliot's epigraphs. I can't remember the title, but it's going to appear on screen magically right here because I'm going to do some editing later. So he wrote this book. We've used it in the past. If anyone has watched the episode that I did that covered chapter 10, and that was just the epigraph for chapter 10 because there was so much material on it. It was about the unskinned bear. Some of you may remember that because that's just such an interesting image. What the unskinned bear is an alive bear. That's what it is. And I'll put a link in my description box if you haven't seen it, because it just shows how much Adam Roberts is able to bring to those little verses at the beginning of each chapter of Middlemarch, which we can sometimes just read and think, lovely, let's get into the novel proper. What Adam Roberts has to say about this epigraph is that it shows Eliot's fascination with a particular Greek poet, and his name was Theocritus. And I knew nothing about Theocritus. I might have recognized the name. I might have thought, that's a name. That's a name that's been said a great deal, but that's as far as I could have gone. George Eliot's partner, George Henry Lewes, remarked in as late as 1870 that he found it difficult, and this is quoting from him, to seduce Polly away from her beloved Theocritus. Polly was his pet name for Eliot, and in Eliot's writings, her first mention of Theocritus is 20 years earlier in 1855, and there she's influenced by the enthusiasm of the author of the book that she is reviewing, because they gave Theocritus very high praise. They called him the most tempting author in the world and the great master of pastoral poetry. Now, maybe that's where Eliot started her fascination. By the way, in addition to quoting Adam Roberts, I'm also quoting another Eliot scholar, Leslie Gordon. And in my description box, well, it's going to look like a bibliography, my description box. I'm going to link you to Leslie Gordon's article, which Adam Roberts led me to, which also talks about Theocritus and Eliot's fascination with that poet. Gordon is suggesting that Eliot began reading Theocritus for herself in 1861, around that time. And of course, she could read the Greek. So 8 years before she began Middlemarch, she's reading this poet. Her journals record her reading his collective poems, which are known as the Idylls. Now, both Leslie Gordon and Adam Roberts put forward theories that Eliot took inspiration from these poems, and that inspiration probably influenced the way she structured her novel, Felix Holt. and they talk about brief mentions of Theocritus in Adam Bede and Romola. Eliot kept notebooks, of course, with her research as she was doing all her novels, and she has one for the planning of Middlemarch, and that notebook frequently mentions Theocritus. And what the notebooks show is that what Eliot has done, this epigraph is an English interpretation of 2 lines from Idyll 16 by Theocritus. Leslie Gordon says Eliot transcribed the Greek into her notebook. You can find it there. So the epigraph, it's not a translation. I am not sure if there's a technical term for what Eliot has actually done. Some of the words are correctly translated from the Greek, but some words are more interpretive, more creative. So in a way, the epigraph is more of an adaptation. Eliot is playing with the text to make something that's similar but also different, something more English in poetic structure as well as in language. Now, the only way to demonstrate this, of course, is to put a translation on screen alongside the epigraph. And so that's what you're seeing now. You are seeing a translation by A.S.F. Gow, who did his work in 1950. He was a Cambridge academic, and he was quoted by Leslie Gordon. And his translation of this part of Theocritus is, "The Muses are goddesses, and him their fellow gods, but we are mortals here below, and being such, of mortals let us sing." And then you see alongside Eliot's epigraph, "Let the high muse chant love's Olympian. We are but mortals, and must sing of man." Or, if I do this in the iambic pentameter, which is very clear in the epigraph, "Let thee, high muse, chant love's Olympian. We are but mortals, and must sing of man." So I put a bit more stress, clumsily, because it doesn't read very well. I think one should not read too much of the iambic pentameter, too stressful, or it doesn't really sound great as poetry. But you can see that what she's trying to do is distill a concept from Theocritus and bring it into an English poetic form. So by using iambic pentameter in 2 lines, you get evocations of Shakespeare, don't you? Because this looks like the heroic couplet at the end of one of his sonnets. Now, if you become interested in this whole business and you think, Theocritus, who was he? What did he write? Why did he write? And so on. In my description box, you'll find a link to the Hellenic Age podcast, quite a good little video. And this episode that I've linked to discusses Theocritus and a poetic movement which was shifting away from describing the idyllic, the divine, the feats of heroes who are the offspring of gods and therefore destined to have a higher sort of life. Theocritus was starting to aim for poems that moved down into the human level and celebrated that realism at the human level rather than at the fantastic. And that spirit, I think, coordinates very nicely with Middlemarch, very nicely, really, with 19th century English novels, which were trying to be extremely realistic about the world people were living in, as opposed to what had come before with the Romantics, the sort of higher legends, Sir Walter Scott type things, which were always aiming at the superlative rather than the ordinary. Now, we could go on and on about Theocritus. That's how good this epigraph was. We could talk about Idyll 16 and how relevant it is to modern day artists who are trying to make a living from their work in capitalist society. I certainly got pulled interesting ideas from reading a translation, Gow's translation, all the way through for Idyll 16. It was really interesting. So we may come back to that. But this is Middlemarch meditation. So we must get back to Middlemarch, get back to chapter 27. And here we are clearly looking at, are we not, the love of mortals. And I love it because Eliot starts by evoking science and creating a little parable. And then she's almost, I would say, scientific in her close, minute observation of what each of these two, Lidgett and Rosamund Vincy, are doing to each other, how they're reacting to each other, what's going on in their respective brains, how they are doing love almost in a microscopic way. So going into the text, we start with, you don't get my face, you get this weird photograph. You think, what's this? Well, I was searching for a photograph online of the phenomenon that Eliot's narrator describes in the first paragraph of chapter 27. Took me ages. The problem of giving search engines just the right instructions so that you don't get a lot of images of just candles or different finishes of stainless steel, which was interesting but not helpful for the Middlemarch meditation. So this demonstrates the narrator's parable, doesn't it? A polished steel surface reflecting back a single light source. And even though it's clear, we can tell that there are fine scratches on that steel and they're going in every direction, the visual effect in the light is that there's this aura in which it seems that all the scratches are magically aligning themselves into a bright halo around the light source. And the narrator tells us this is a parable. So they're saying, hang on, now do what you would do if you were reading, I don't know, the New Testament parables. The point is you're supposed to then consult the key. What does each symbol mean? And then understand the meaning. And the narrator gives you the key. They say, okay, the light is the individual ego, and the scratches on the stainless steel, they're just life events, those random things going in all directions, all things which could be observed. But the light is the ego. It is the way the eye of the individual is going to see those events and how they're going to deem them meaningful, how they're going to create a pattern of meaning from those events. This is actually, it's a good parable about how tarot works as well, if I might digress just a little bit. A tarot reading works in kind of the same way. The cards that are selected in a reading, they have multiple shades of meaning of themselves, and those meanings are further multiplied by the other cards that a person might draw during a reading. So they're all the scratches. There's just lots and lots and lots and lots of meanings that could be drawn from these cards. The querent, the person who asked for the reading, selects the images and the meanings that are holding their attention most. That is usually what I ask them to focus on, what matters to them in the card, not everything in the card, but what matters to them. And from what I notice them noticing, we start talking, and that pattern that we notice becomes meaningful. And the rest of the section that we read here in chapter 27, it seems to me that in addition to being sort of a scientific observation, it's also kind of a little stock taking of the peculiar way that Rosamund Vincy and Tertius Lidgett are selecting the events that they are going to notice and how they align those events with who they are and who they have been made to be. I think that's probably even more important. It would make a good first lesson in relationship counseling, I think, to read this chapter and to explain to the partners who've come in for counseling how two people cannot experience the same events, even though they experience the same events. The counselor could have taken that thought further. Two people who have lived together for many years will have been together for many, many, many events, yes? But their individual mental pictures of that shared past will differ. They won't remember the same things quite as clearly. They will have different verdicts about how certain things went, and each partner, looking back on those events as a whole, will have constructed a different sort of verdict about themselves and a different verdict about their relationship. And this section is showing how early this process of exclusive optical selection, because that's what it is, and that's why I chose to title this Middlemarch episode that. It's about this strange business we have that as egos looking out through eyes, we take what we see and what we experience sensorially, and we give it order and meaning. We decide what is important and why important and in what way important. And that as a couple are discovering each other and working their way through this process of attraction, the weird thing is they are accumulating completely different catalogs of information about how that relationship went. So on page 266, for example, Eliot's narrator says that both Lidgett and Rosamund are recognizing a mutual fascination. They're twigging that something's happening in their head, and it's also something is happening in the other person's head from what they can read off the face. Maybe also because they want it to happen. This has to be taken into account as well. They are shared events. Dr. Lidgett must speak with Rosamund because he doesn't feel Mrs. Vincy is sufficiently compos mentis. She's a little bit hysterical. So he thinks, okay, I need a person who's a little bit more together to talk to. And in the midst of these everyday exchanges, both of them start to perceive that behind behind appearances, there's something else. They are looking at each other, but not just looking at each other because they must in order to carry on a polite conversation, but because they enjoy looking at each other. And once they realize this, their social conditioning kicks in, and they are conscious of this social imperative, aren't they? That it's all right to feel something, but not all right necessarily to show it. And the narrator goes on to say, this situation, it doesn't have to mean anything serious. Lots of people probably have moments with lots of other people where they just recognize, I like you and I think you like me. There's something about the way we're doing our body language to each other which suggests that we're getting on really well, really well. Now, what that can become depends on the circumstances, doesn't it? And while both Lidget and Rosamond, because they've been trained by social convention to be careful what they show, so they're not behaving as if it means anything serious, the narrator gives us this benefit of X-ray psychological vision. And we know that while Lidget is perfectly capable of keeping things light and not necessarily meaningful, and this doesn't necessarily have to go anywhere, wow, Rosamond, she's keeping things light in appearance, but the text clearly states she did not distinguish flirtation from love. Ooh, unfortunate, because a lot of flirtation happens, and it need not mean love. It could mean just friendliness. It can mean just, I get on with you really well. I now know that I can tease a little bit. It's okay. I'm safe. But Rosamond, she's gone on in the future. No one else knows that she's gone on into the future. She sees herself being carried by fair winds like a sailing ship. She's on a journey already. Nobody else is. And there's space in her mind, very well hidden space, where she's keeping some images, almost like a little dollhouse. And it's the home that she imagines that she's soon going to have once she marries Dr. Lidget. She's gone all that way in her mind. And why? Because he loves her. He's flirting with her, so he loves her. So he loves her, so he'll marry her. The marriage is going to require the acquisition of a house, of course. In her mind, this happens, and the acquisition of a house means you need to acquire furniture and a parlor because you're going to do regular entertaining. She's already months and months ahead of anyone else, and only she knows this. She's kept this deeply, deeply secret. So in truth, this part of chapter 27 is focusing on Rosamond and her incredible ability privately to act just like the girls that she would despise, those girls who are kind of awkwardly driven by their impulses. Well, to be truthful, Rosamond's still driven by impulses, that's for sure, but she's careful. She's so careful that doesn't become publicly noticeable in any way. And in this way, she is Mrs. Lemon's perfect pupil. And I think what Eliot's narrator is telling us is that please don't think evil of Rosamond. Please don't paint her the villain here, because you must remember, you really must, everything Rosamond does, regardless of how it might strike us, it's a product of how she has been taught that she should operate as an unmarried woman. Mrs. Lemon's school equipped Rosamond with the principles for living graciously as an upper-class English lady. Now, the strictures about how one should communicate as an unmarried woman, they're complicated. You were meant to converse with gentlemen. How else were you to find a husband? And yet at the same time, what you said and how you reacted, it seemed to me, whenever I have read instruction manuals for young women dated around the early to mid 19th century in England, is that they seem to contradict. They seem to ask the young lady to be both deceptive and very honest. And at the same time, and you really would have to be a model of a certain kind of rationality to figure out when you ought to be deceptive and when it would be bad to be so. What I'm going to read now is a segment from an etiquette book written in 1859 called The Lady's Guide to Perfect Gentility. And it's a chapter about communication and conversation. So it's very worthwhile. I think if I just read it out, you're going to see the contradictions in here, but you're also going to see echoes of exactly what Rosamond is doing. So in other words, we're going to see Rosamond is operating by the book totally. So we are reading from Chapter 4, The Art of Conversing with Fluency and Propriety. Always seek to converse with gentlemen in whose society you may be introduced, with a dignified modesty and simplicity, which will effectively check, on their part, any attempt at familiarity. But never say or do anything that may lead them to suppose you are soliciting their notice. An instance can scarcely be recalled of a lady, either by direct or indirect means, attempting to storm a man's heart into admiration who did not effectively defeat her purpose, and instead of the coveted homage to her charms, awaken a feeling directly its opposite. If a gentleman approaches you with words of flattery and profuse attentions, especially after a short acquaintance, extend no encouraging smile or word, for a flatterer can never be otherwise than an unprofitable companion. It is better, by a dignified composure, to appear not to notice, than with smiles and blushes to disclaim flattery, since these are frequently considered as encouragements for further effusions of these painted words. You may, with propriety, accept such delicate attentions as polished and refined men are desirous of paying, but never solicit them, or appear to be expecting them. Much of the civility of fashionable life savors strongly of deception. We refer not only to the habit which some ladies have of sending word to visitors that they are not at home when they are only engaged, but to the painful regrets that are often expressed at a distance between calls, to the unspeakable joy which is manifested on a meeting a fashionable acquaintance, to the earnest importunity that is exhibited for early visits, when the truth is, in each case, that the real feeling is that of absolute indifference. Guard against duplicity in all its forms. Rely upon it, it is not necessary to true politeness. Beware of talking too much if you do not talk to the purpose. The less you say, the better. But even if you do, and if withal you are gifted with the best powers of conversation, it will be wise for you to guard against excessive loquacity. By this, we do not advise you to yield to a prudish reserve, but even that would scarcely be a more offensive extreme than to monopolize the conversation of a whole circle. Avoid even the appearance of pedantry. If you are conversing with persons of very limited attainments, you will make yourself far more acceptable, as well as useful to them, by accommodating yourself to their capacities, than by compelling them to listen to what they cannot understand. I want to focus on one statement in particular that the book makes. It says, much of the civility of fashionable life savors strongly of deception. Yes, it absolutely does. The whole of Victorian etiquette was about giving an appearance that did not mirror the internal reality of the person. And I don't know why they're so against it. They go on to say, oh, guard against duplicity in all its forms. Rely upon it. It is not necessary for true politeness. I say, oh, except it kind of was. Except it kind of was. There were approved and unapproved kinds of deception. And you had to know, as a young woman, which was which. Which did you do and which did you not do? If you did the wrong one, woe betide you. Woe betide you, because then you gained the reputation of being deceptive, even though every woman around you was being deceptive. Rosamond, whose behavior conforms very tightly to this lady's guide, you realize that you've heard nothing and seen nothing from Rosamond so far that contradicts anything that I read in that guide. And I could not find anything in that guide where I thought, oh, Rosamond Vincy didn't know how to do that. Oh, she did. And let's look at a few points that match the book here. What Rosamond doesn't do, she does not betray how serious her feelings for Mr. Lidgett actually are. That's important. She shouldn't. The book says that. Don't betray your feelings. Don't give away how much you want or are seeking the attentions of a man. She does not show any unbecoming knowledge. The book states, she hardly ever says anything that can be traced back to a fact, because her conversation is about being pretty, not about being intellectual or clever. And she does not devise falsehoods either. No. You would be hard put to say that anything she said was a direct lie. But then her statements sometimes, as it says, they lack a bit of truth. They just don't state something as truth. But then that wasn't the point of Ladies' Conversation. Ladies' Conversation was not meant to teach, to enlighten, to show. It was meant to be pretty. It was meant to be entertaining, like a little piece of music was meant to be entertaining. And in this way, I think this small section of chapter 27 is subtly criticizing the way women were socialized at the time, and by pointing out that the social skills taught to women, the skills that were marketed as so important, so vital for ensuring they lived a good life, kept a good reputation, got a good husband, those skills served women very poorly because they were almost always a form of deception across the board. It's just that some forms were okay and other forms not so okay. And it served men poorly as well. It served everybody poorly. I mean, think of Lidgett. He considers the prettiest aspect of the female mind is that it worships man in utter ignorance of what they really are. Well, what good is that? What good is that? Rosamond does exactly this, of course. She worships an idea of Lidgett, something that's come out of her head. It's utterly unconnected to the real man. How can any good, healthy relationship be built on this strange foundation of mutual deception? And that, everybody, is today's Middlemarch meditation done. Really enjoyed it. We're going to finish chapter 27. I believe I've got to really get on with the script for that, though, because it's already Monday. It just seems like time is flying. And when the hot weather comes out, it gets more difficult to get free time for filming and editing because really people start asking you to come outside. And I mean, you'd be a fool not to, right? After all the months of dreary weather in winter, I was rewatching one of my videos from earlier in the year. And I noticed myself all dressed up warmly and saying, oh, is anybody feeling like January's just lasting forever? So now it's May, the sun is out, it is in the late 20s, early 30s degrees Celsius here. And you know, you should go outside. I think it's a healthy thing to do. So maybe I'll be late a little bit with the other meditation, but I think you'll forgive me because you may be having lovely weather as well and out doing other things yourself. So I hope that you managed to get some reading done and that you're enjoying it very much in this sunny, active, out-of-door month. And I'll look forward to seeing you in a few days' time, but I'll keep you posted. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.